Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today, I am joined with Shadow Starshine and Darren McStravick. I think I said your name right there, Darren.
Yeah.
Um, um, Essentially, we are going to be discussing veganism and metaethics. Well, I'm not. I'm pretty much moderating. I'm just sitting back, relaxing, and having a nice time for once. I'm not under the spotlight, but these two gentlemen are going to have at it in the most civil way possible, and that's what I'm here to maintain. So, if you would like to introduce yourselves.
Hey, everybody, I'm Shadow Starshine. You guys know me from vegan debates and just hanging around the community. Um, we're gonna be discussing metaethics. Yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself too.
Okay, so I I'm that guy who spent like a few hours trying to introduce myself last time I was on the show. Apologies again for that. I was a moral subjectivist turned moral realist once I actually understood the definition of moral realism and did sufficient study to actually produce more robust positions that do actually push towards having prescriptive power. Yeah, I guess that pretty much describes where I stand right now relative to where this stream is going to be going subject-wise and conversation-wise. So yeah, I guess yeah.
Yeah. Now, I will say that last little comment about prescriptive power is probably where this debate is going to be. Because I think that Shadow was kind of not having a nice time in the chat when me and Darren were discussing more realism last time, and this is why we're here today. So we're going to start with. Would you like to start with metaethics? We'll start with the meta and go bottom up. Kind
Good
of,
idea.
yeah. That way, I think Shadow really wants to get into applied. Shadow loves working on applied because he's a descriptivist. Now, Darren really likes working on meta. So we're going to try and make this as balanced as possible. This debate is probably going to go on for 2 hours. So I kind of want to make sure that we get onto applied by 20 past 2. So that's about an hour from now. So if you are ready, who would like to introduce metaethics?
It doesn't really matter. This is just going to be a discussion. It's not so much going to be a debate format. So let's start because in my position is that an ought statement can be made, but it can only be entailed hypothetically to a value someone holds. I also consider values to be pre-linguistic judgments, and that tends to be a distinction between a lot of moral realists where they think it does start in the linguistic realm, as in we rationally decide. But I think while we do use linguistics to rationally figure out what we ought to do in relation to those pre-linguistic sensations that we already experience. So I'm not 100% against, most realism approaches, because I agree that, we can say given your condition, given the general human condition, or given your individual condition, here are ways for you to experience what is good. But I don't think we can say, here's what you should experience as good. This is what you ought to experience as good. I don't think the brain works like that. It can only work in relation to things it previously had.
Sure. Would you call yourself a particularist by any chance?
I don't find the distinction too relevant, because like a particularist is to me a way of saying, I can't seem to find any universals. Every time I'm in a situation, it changes. Whereas someone who's more, principled would say, well, given these situations all seem to have something in common, so I'm willing to say that, for every time X occurs, I will feel good.
Right. So what exactly is your major gripe with the idea that or of moral realism, such that you don't agree with it, that you don't subscribe to it? Like, what is the main contention?
I think my main contention is at the base level of like how we develop values to begin with. I think they're more pre-linguistic, so we'll come out as innately our human nature, and we'll have things that we just innately value, like certain sensations or or perhaps certain visual structures like a face or something will be automatically drawn to it. We have all these base instincts. And then I think we start categorizing things as good as they relate to our previous values. So it's like, you know, whenever my mother gives me milk, I start putting her into a category of, you know, a human shape or that sort of thing. And that starts to become what is good for me.
Okay,
So
well, that's fairly non-cognitivistic. Would you agree?
at a baseline, yes. Now, I would
baseline.
go into a cognitivism later, because then we can start using rationality to decide how we can make those things come about. But I don't think like how we can propagate situations that bring about good situations for me. So that's a cognitive stance. But to say that here's the way your brain will operate, it would be better if your brain operated this way and found this sort of thing good. I think we cannot do that. Those are the sorts of things we can't prescribe.
Okay, so say, for instance, you are indispensably against the value or against the experience of not being able to breathe, not being able to go about life without experiencing extreme wheezing. Now, say, for instance, you're also strongly, but not indispensably, for the present experience that smoking gives you. Because if you don't do that, you start to experience dispensable negative valuation. Now, if you still maintain to the idea that you don't want those ones that are indispensably negatively valued, how do you maintain that you are still valuing those things whilst valuing these dispensables at the cost of them?
Right. Well, maybe I might not agree with the distinction between dispensable or indispensable. You could say breathing is dispensable if you could get yourself into a mindset. But I would argue that, you know, if we put things into hierarchies, our desire to live tends to trump everything else, right?
So when I say dispensable, I mean dispensable in the positive versus negative phenomenological experience.
Sure. And people can become suicidal and just think of death as good, right? Like this is a possibility that we can get to. But for the majority of people, you know, we're putting life as important. So that's why we're calling the other thing dispensable, because it is weaker in strength, right? We're saying my desire to smoke is of weaker power than my desire to continue to breathe and be healthy.
Yeah, so that would, if anything, that just analyzes contingencies along the lines of what could or could not fall within the category of the general universal category of positive valuation. So I don't think it's very productive to just simply exhaust certain examples, especially because philosophy just does not work by simply exhausting contingent particulars. It works more so by exhausting the categoricals. So in the case of pleasure, say, for instance, you cannot dispense of that as being a positive valuation, if anything, because it is the phenomenological experience of positive valuation. It is that, that manifestation. So
I think it's basically tautological.
Yeah, for sure. So in the case that, say, for instance, it is indispensably negative that experiencing the effects of smoking, of course, is indispensable. How do you say that you're actually maintaining to that in a cognitive sense, whilst valuing, say, smoking in the present, because it's simply it is positive as opposed to negative when you don't smoke? How do you maintain that you're still holding to the value of pleasure, that you're still being cognitivistic?
No, though this is the thing, because this is not the area that I dismiss realism. This is the part where I agree with realism, is that you can make those sort of statements. It's like, look, you got these sorts of values, and yes, I agree that smoking, the sensation of it, is one of your values, but it necessarily leads to one of your negative values. And I think cognitivism is very good at pointing these sorts of things out. What it's not good at is saying things like, well, you know what? You don't like your health. You don't like bad health. Well, why don't you just start liking bad health? Wouldn't that make your life easier? Wouldn't you have more pleasure if you liked being unhealthy? And I would say, well, now we're just talking nonsense, right? You can't prescribe that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I would say that in order for there to be some degree of cognitivism, that there has to be some sort of idea of reliabilism towards something that is categorical. So in the case of my position, if anything, I would say that that there needs to be some sort of reliabilist conception of how exactly we go about achieving pleasure, as pleasure is the category of positive valuation, which urges our actions. And that in and of itself is how we derive prescriptions in the first place, about being well advised to do things. Now, we could actually discuss that, or if you want to actually just quickly go down that route.
Sure.
Yeah, so ultimately, there are two ways of going about oughts. There's the teleological, and there's also the deontological. Now, what would you say you subscribe to yourself?
Oh, I'm not sure. Just give me a distinction, because I never really think of any of those terms.
Sure. So, this is briefly in the case of the deontological conception of ought, they're holding that an ought is simply a description of what you are duty bound to do. So, what is jurisprudential?
Right.
And the teleological is simply to say that someone is well advised to perform an action in view of what would best serve their interests. So,
well, then definitely that one.
Okay, so then it's definitely possible to achieve oughts, because there are specific interests that we can definitively be well advised to act in comportment to. So, in the case,
yeah, I agree. But
yeah,
our main disagreement is going to be what those oughts entail to, right? And you might say that, well, we can take an objective stance to figure out what it should entail to. And that's where I say, no, I don't think we can, because I think what we are as a person is built up pre-linguistically. It's a combination of your innate nature and your experiences in this world, right?
I don't think the whole idea of pre-linguistic valuation, or is that a correct expression of what it is that you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah.
So pre-linguistic valuation. Okay, sure. I don't think that in and of itself deflates anything that my position holds towards or is committed to. Because if anything, I would say that indispensables are in and of themselves pre-linguistic. It doesn't seem to have any sort of conflict with any ideas that are necessary to uphold realism.
Now, what would you say is indispensable? Because that might be where we disagree.
The category of positive valuation, pleasure.
And are you saying pleasure must be derived from a specific sensation or a specific experience, or can it come from anything?
Okay, so of course there are two ways of going about what is pleasure. There's the way of just simply describing certain states, and so I'd say that it is conditional. So when we're talking about certain things, like say for instance, what causes pleasure in the situation where you're like out at a county fair or something like that, and you're seeing all these rides that you get pleasure from, that you like. Yeah, of course, that'd be a case of like just contingency, the contingency approach. But then I would also argue that what we can only talk about when we're trying to establish a cognitivistic ought that is capable of being prescribed to other people, not just oneself, is the categorical one. The categorical type of pleasure. It's an essential constituent component of one of our propositional attitude states. So one of our propositional attitude states that literally is relevant to this, of course, is desire. Now, desire is comprised of two essential components, or else it's not desire. So it's comprised of action urgency, and it's comprised of that other part that we tend to quantify over when we're doing morality, which is pleasure. So when we're talking about morality, we're talking about pleasure in the sense of that category, that essential constituent component that comprises desire. But when we're talking about other different situations, we're talking about a first order. So I think the way to really truly distinguish how we talk about pleasure is first order, which is like, say, for instance, the county fair example, that's first order pleasure. And then second order pleasure is the category.
Sure. But we got to figure out how to usefully put this towards any applied situation.
Yeah.
So
If I can just jump in for a second, I think if I'm understanding just in a philosophical way that might be worth if you want to Google it, I think the distinction that Darren's making is sometimes known as the difference between first order and second order desires.
Sure.
Typically. So just in case anyone wanted to look that up later, there we go.
Yeah, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually has a pretty good complete elaboration of what desire is, and that's something I've actually made pretty good use of just recently.
So let's take this to an applied situation. Say, this is the situation I threw at Lewis before when we had our discussion. Is like, let's say we have a psychopathic murderer, right?
Mm-hmm.
He derives pleasure from whenever he kills somebody. He's very upset when he doesn't. Now, what sorts of things do you think you can prescribe to this person?
Okay, I can prescribe that he starts acting in comportment to other people's well-being.
Wow.
So this is a very this is the kind of question I was expecting to get later on down the track after I kind of like elaborated my framework, because unless we can define the terms that would basically be the components, the operators for the kind of answer that I could give you, like I don't think the type of answer that I would give you would be satisfying without begging the question. So when I say that the way I would prescribe him, like I can only say that I would prescribe him anything when I've fully established what it is to prescribe someone anything in particular, especially morally. Now, first and foremost, when it comes to the case of this type of monster person, it's not a matter of what they particularly get pleasure from, because once again, that's the key difference between first and second order pleasure. So in the case of morality, it's not about what is fully exhaustive of his essential constituent ideas that actually comprise his first order pleasure. It's about his second order. It's about what is the type of thing that he's valuing. And ultimately, that is going to be independent of how he currently feels. His current sensational states are, in fact, different and separate from a discussion about his propositional attitude states. Because when you say that you value pleasure, that is a categorical statement. You're not saying you're valuing, say, the interaction between your sense perception and an ice cream cone. That's very different to saying that you value pleasure. So, and the only reason you can say that you value an ice cream cone is because it does provide you with that category of pleasure. Now, you can say the same thing about, say, a serial murderer killing people, but he's killing people under the value of causing misery for the sake of it. So, the idea that's ultimately a contradiction, at least implicitly. So however you want to frame it, it's either an implicit or explicit contradiction in terms of the fact that you cannot help but value pleasure, but at the same time, you are valuing the negation of pleasure for the sake of it. I
would say that he is forced to value his own pleasure. I don't see how he's forced to value anyone else's pleasure. So you're going to say, look,
it's not a matter of, okay, so that's the difference.
No, but I understand you. Your argument is attempting to go from, well, you categorically value pleasure because you have pleasure and you value it. Therefore, it's categorical, and categorical means that it applies to other people, and therefore you value other people.
It doesn't mean that it applies to other people. It is just an essential constituent component that isn't just simply a construction of minds in general, plural. So when I say that he is valuing pleasure categorically, it's not just simply that he's valuing pleasure because it's I don't even know how to really to fully articulate what I'm trying to get at here, but ultimately I think the problem is that when we try to say that we are talking about the value of pleasure in the categorical sense, there's no possibility to deflate the framework that's talking about second order pleasure by appealing to, say, for instance, the serial killer's value of first order pleasure. First order pleasure does not have precedence over second order pleasure. So when you bring up the example to deflate the framework that I'm presenting, you're actually making a category error. You're making the category error of appealing to first order pleasure, second order pleasure.
I'm not. I'm redefining the second order pleasure as his pleasure and not a category that includes everything else.
That doesn't allow it to be second order pleasure. Second order pleasure is in and of itself. It's a category that's in and of itself. It's not just something that's categorically exhibited by a single individual. It's something that is essential to this idea of mind and mind in and of itself. So in order for these things to be that category, they need to have these essential constituent components. They need to have these independent things. It's not necessarily just a simple construction of the mind or something that differs per person. When someone has desire, that is univocally that category.
Yeah, I understand that it's within the category, but it isn't the category.
Yes, it is. That's the point. It is the category. So, but the reason, I think the reason that you're saying it's not the category is because you're saying that his first order desires are not that category. And that's why I'm saying it's a category error to say that, to even point to the idea that he gets pleasure from killing people. That's independent of the critique.
I have three different tiers here. One,
if I may quickly interrupt you guys, I think that this is going to go in a nice way, but I'm worried it's going to end up with going circular, because this is where you're going to disagree a lot. And I think you're probably going to have to talk about the decision-making process and maybe in more depth, maybe explain what categories mean, why we're choosing a categorical decision over maybe a first order. And
I wanted to make some different distinctions.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. So if you just elaborate on the decision-making process that the serial killer or whoever he is going through, then perhaps we can get to the problem, which I think is an epistemic problem that the serial killer is facing, of why you should choose one over another, one desire over another. So
I want to talk about what is even possible. But okay, so I will say we're going to say first order is we're killing people and that we get pleasure from that. Second order, or the next tier, we don't have to necessarily use your philosophical misunderstanding or your understandings. Sorry, that was I didn't mean that.
That's all right. Go ahead.
I'm saying I'm just making my own categories for the sake of the discussion. So so killing someone is pleasurable. That's a category. That's things you can do to cause pleasure. Then there's the next category up, which is my pleasure, right? And that is within the category of all pleasures. So pleasure itself. Yeah, so I'm saying that this person has to value his pleasure because that is what valuing is. He does not have to value killing people, but that is one of the ways that pleasure is derived. And I'm saying the third step up of all pleasures, he also doesn't have to value categorically for any reason whatsoever. It may or may not be that he does, but that is just contingent.
Okay, so the whole idea that I'm really getting at when I'm saying categorical or first and second order is ultimately to outline a difference between dispensable and indispensable valuation. So I'll take this example to epistemics. So in the case of, say, for instance, someone who is an occupant of reality, they cannot not value reality in any case of, say, for instance, a desire, or in any case of a belief. Whenever you have a propositional attitude state that carries your consciousness, you cannot help but be carried by the reality of things that make up those propositional attitude states.
Sure, as long as you're putting abstractions within that idea, because it's a sure. Okay.
Yeah, so there are like, so when I say second order, or when I say categorical, it absolutely has to be indispensable. Because if you're still using the word categorical, I'd probably say it'd be more helpful. I'm not saying this is like an objective argument, but I would say it's probably more helpful if you just use the word subcategorical, because it can be dispensable. It can be dispensed. I mean,
well, I'm saying the categorical can be dispensed, as the category can only exist as a thing that brings pleasure. It is not the sort of category that, by definition, you must find pleasurable, which is pleasure itself. So the category of pleasure is one of those dispensable things which you may or may not hold. I mean, this seems very intuitive when you just look at reality, and like for a serial killer could go his whole life murdering people and never getting caught and being like, wow, I had a great friggin' life. This was great. I've completely disregarded other people's pleasure and I feel great about it. And then he dies, and that's a happy life for him.
For sure. Okay, so my main critique of that is the fact that it is an inconsistent valuation of the category of pleasure. That's the crux of my framework.
What is it inconsistent with?
It's inconsistent with the valuation of the with second order category of pleasure itself, because pleasure isn't just contained in oneself; it's contained in other agents, other sentient agents, to be specific. And the reason is because they also contain the propositional attitude state desire, and desire univocally contains the category, the second order category, pleasure. So it's not just contained in the individual, and the individual doesn't just value pleasure because he is the one who has it. It's because it is found in him that he values himself, not because it's not that he values pleasure because it's found in himself. It's the other way around. It's that he values himself because he experiences pleasure.
I guess that's where we disagree, but I don't. Well, how would you go about? Well, how would you go about solving that? Like, now, let's say that either one of those things is a possibility, and we wanted to get to the bottom of it. Now, what steps would you do to try and look at reality in order to figure out which one is the case?
Okay, so this could take us down the route of philosophy of mind. So, because we need to be able to identify what is morally relevant. That is ultimate in being able to make moral decisions. You have to take into consideration what consequences. Now, what consequences are relevant, and what do produce whatever is the thing that we're trying to get when we're acting morally. So, do you not think that it'd be more prudent that we go down that route instead of just simply try to blindfoldedly answer that kind of question?
No, like, I think this question is very important because it says,
Sure.
but it's going to determine what sorts of things we can say later.
Okay, so could you restate the question perhaps more vividly, I guess?
Sure. So we'll say it's possible that someone values themselves because they value pleasure themselves, and pleasure themselves has been found in them, so that they value pleasure in themselves and everyone that it's found in. That's the way it works. The second possibility is they value themselves because they are pleasure. That is just definitional. They don't value the category. It just comes from within, and that's the basis upon all evaluations. Now, what sorts of tests would we do to figure out which one of these is the case?
Okay. Oh, wait. What do you mean? Which what? Hold on. What do you actually mean?
Okay, I'll try again. Right?
Yeah.
So we have a category called pleasure itself.
Mm-hmm.
And one view is to say, if something holds pleasure itself, it is valuable. I am one of those people who holds pleasure themselves, so I'm valuable. This is your categorical approach to it, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
Right? And then we have the second possibility that I value myself, I only value myself because pleasure comes from me, not the category of pleasure. I don't care about the category of pleasure, but just because I am me, and pleasure derives from me, and that's where it stops.
Right.
If I may, I think Shadow's almost asking what comes first, the categorization of pleasure as valuable, or the categorization, or the actual categorization of valuation, which leads me to conclude that I evaluate. So he's basically saying, do I begin evaluating, or do I only start evaluating once I've conceptualized what it means to evaluate? Almost, it's almost like what comes first, like the actual act of feeling of evaluating, or the concept, the category in which we are using to evaluate.
Obviously, the act of evaluating.
Right. So then why would a categorical understanding why wouldn't it be anything other than contingent?
Primarily because there are essential constituent components that you do phenomenologically experience every single time that you do experience that whole feeling of pleasure. It is I would say it is a type of acquaintance knowledge, a phenomenological irreducible. That when you're experiencing this type of pleasure, what makes it univocally itself is the fact that it is that phenomenological thing. So that's not contingent.
That still agrees with my position. It doesn't move beyond into the categorical understanding.
It just did. It's that category of phenomenological positive valuation. That's immediately categorical.
No, but the phenomenological experience is what's valuable. It's not the category. You're saying because the phenomenological experience is in a category, we therefore value the category. Well, that doesn't have to be the case. It's just like saying, I value people, like I value my mother. My mother's in the category humans. I value humans. That doesn't have to follow.
For sure. Maybe I'll reevaluate my framework with regards to this. Yeah, I see your point. I still hold. I'm still not completely convinced that that it doesn't actually. It doesn't like it's not capable of being conceptualized in such a way that is substantively the case that, the category is the thing that you're valuing. I'm not entirely convinced that that's not possibly the case, because maybe I just haven't fully conceptualized the truth of it. So
I think somebody could value, like I said, a categorical understanding could be a contingent thing one does value, and that's probably where you would lead to veganism, because somebody is saying, well, this is pleasure. I value the category. This category is found in these sorts of beings. I value these beings. I would say, well, that makes entire sense. But if that's contingent,
I think I know the problem here. Okay, so I ultimately, when you're referring to the category, it is just univocally that thing in of itself. It's not that you value. Okay, so I think I know the problem. It's not necessarily that you value the category. It's the fact that value is in of itself the exhaustive category of positive valuation. Now, the whole idea is that is reflexive. You don't need to value that category. As soon as that category is exhibited by your mind, and of course I would say that it is probably necessary. That sounds like a contradiction. I'll rethink that sometime in the future. That as soon as that category is exhibited by you, you are literally driven by it. It literally does necessitate, according to your actual physiology, according to how you are in reality, that it does in fact undergird what drives your actions as a conscious agent in any given sense.
I think this is the part where we do agree, right? Where we're both saying that we're driven by our phenomenological experience. Pleasure is the action urging thing, and that's we're just speaking in tautologies at this point. We're saying that's what good is. That's what it's all the same thing. We want it, so we go for it. But I'm just saying that we can't say that, because one of the things that I'm doing is within a set. It's an item within a set. Therefore, I value the set. And I would say, no. That's a contingency. We could value the set. We don't have to value the set. We have to value the item in the set because it is us, and it's what drives us.
Okay, so you cannot help but positively value the set of all positive values, because you value every last exhaustive value that constitutes that set. What defines that set is positive valuation. That's what I'm talking about.
But I could I could just go ahead and like the fact that I'm an item within that set and love to destroy every other item in my
What do you mean that you're an item within that set?
Well, okay, in the set of things that can experience phenomenological goodness, I am an item within that set. You know, Shadow, Starshine, that's one of the things that could do that.
Okay. Oh, I see. You're an object
Right.
that does in fact exhibit it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an object in the set. Now I have to value that object because I am that object, and that's what valuing is. I don't have a choice in that. That's that. But I do not need to value all the other objects within the set, as in to say that I have to value the set and all things contained within it. And that's where we get to the serial killer, right? He obviously values himself as an object within the set, but all the things that derive pleasure for him are currently murdering people, right?
Sure.
Now we could say, sure, it's possible that he could pick up a new desire later on, and maybe that desire will go away, and that's all completely possible. But if it's currently the case that he likes murdering people, he doesn't have to value the category. He clearly doesn't, and he clearly derives pleasure by not valuing the category. And I don't see how we can prescribe to someone like that, well, you should value that category. Or maybe even go...
How do you get to the point of saying that he doesn't value that category if it is literally just definitively the necessary category of all positive valuations?
Because he values himself as an item within the category, but he's excluding every other item in that category. So it is entirely...
No, hold on. I don't think you're understanding what I'm actually saying. What I'm saying is it is the literal category of all possible positive valuations. So he cannot help but be like it's like an incorrigible. It's the set of all incorrigibles, if anything. If you want to describe it that way, I probably won't hold to calling it incorrigible because I know how that can be problematic, especially metaphysically or conceptually. But it is just to put it in more vivid terms. It is technically like it's like an incorrigible. It's a set of all incorrigibles that you cannot help but positively value. And I think probably a better way to actually talk about what I mean when I say second order pleasure, I would say that say for instance, through the senses, whether or not you experience noxious stimuli would probably be a good segue into basically properly describing what I completely mean when I say second order pleasure, because ultimately there has to be some sort of tangibility behind it in order for it to not fall into these kinds of problems. There has to be some sort of independency that's appended to it.
Well, I'm saying it does fall into these sorts of problems. This is the problem of humanity. This is where we're at.
For sure.
Right? I mean, I might agree with you that if you were right, then we would be out of this problem, but that doesn't mean I would think it's right.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I want to make perfectly clear is I don't think I have the solution to the problem. I'm trying to run through it and see exactly how far a given possible solution can get, and whilst maintaining logical coherency and conceptual coherency, etc. All these kinds of things.
I feel like that might be a sort of distraction if we're really going to look at morality as it is. If it really is contained within an egoistic phenomenological desire and it's not some sort of category, then the approach of trying to figure out what we can do with that would be better spent on like at least acknowledging the situation we find ourselves in. Now, I would say that, in a mimetic sense, morality always has progress, right? We have moral progress, because I would say that humans, we do have an innate nature, and we do have enough plasticity to pick up desires and to be molded by our experience. And I would say that it's got like this, mimetic feature that whatever sorts of rules and things we come up with tend to move towards more value expression, right? We tend to make rules that allow us to do more things, and be able to propagate more desires. And I still think there's like a very, I guess that's somewhat of a realist conception that's like, and that I think is worth talking about. But it still relates to the human nature, and I don't think you could take an individual human and say, well, you're not in this category of moral progress, therefore you should be. Well, I'd say that's nonsense. Like he's a psychopathic murderer, and that's just how it is. he'll be forgotten by time, but in his time, that is his nature, and we should just accept that. And by accept that, I mean either put him in jail or shoot him.
Yeah, I totally agree with that approach. Okay, so the thing about it is, but like I say, for instance, I don't 100%. I don't know yet if I fully agree with the backing for you're actually reaching that conclusion. But that's just nescience on my behalf. Ultimately, I think the problem that we need to really establish is how exactly do we get to prescriptive powers, and what exactly constitutes prescriptive power in the first place? How exactly do we say that one thing necessarily applies to basically all members of that set? So, of course,
that's what I don't think we can do. I definitely think we can come up with a bunch of hypotheticals. We can apply them to the majority of people who hold these positions because, we all share similar innate natures. We all share similar experiences of the world. We all develop similarly, and we all build those conceptions together. So it's not surprising that we're all similar enough that we can talk about it. But, we're going to have
the whole problem with that is it contains absolutely zero prescriptive power. Now, with having zero prescriptive power, because it's arbitrary. The whole foundation of that kind of system is completely arbitrary. Now, you could say that, oh, well, how do you escape that problem? And that's the thing. We ought to be looking for the solution to that problem, because if we do find the solution to that problem, we'll have a very rigid type of system for determining what we ought to do in all given situations. That is extremely useful. That would be extremely useful. Now, I'm not saying I hold to it completely yet. I'm still looking. But that doesn't, just because it is difficult and just because it does seem like there are certain critiques that do deflate it in certain cases, doesn't mean that it cannot be reconceptualized in such a way to provide us with something that's extremely useful or pragmatic. So there's still a pragmatic reason for still looking for this. Now, this is not me conceding yet. just put that out there because I know where you're coming from. I think this is more of a kind of, we're trying to navigate each other's positions and really find out like where exactly what don't we agree on? Because ultimately, I think it just boils down to there probably being a miscommunication, perhaps on my behalf, perhaps on your behalf. I don't know. So
sure.
The thing about it is, how exactly are you treating morality? What is morality? Is it a science or is it a philosophy? That's something I want to get perfectly clear right now.
Science is a philosophy. Nah, don't give me that. Well, I'm not making that distinction.
Okay.
So you're asking me if it's empirical or not?
Yes, that's the point. Because I would say, that science.
I'm just taking the piss.
Sorry,
I'm just taking the piss here.
You're taking.
No, I think it's I think it's a philosophical endeavor.
Excellent.
But
okay.
Right, like this. I mean, it can eventually be an empirical endeavor once we can scan the brain and we actually understand it. But given that the moment in time, philosophy is far more useful to talk about this. Otherwise, we're just looking at, hey, look, some activities here in the prefrontal cortex. What does that mean? I don't know.
Okay. So do you think... Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, but I think there is a lack of practicality in searching for these solutions, because I think even if you said, wow, like I found these really strong odds, and then you present them to the serial killer and he just murders you, and it's just like, well, where was the practicality there?
That's the whole thing. Not all of his, and that's the point. You wouldn't actually do that. Someone who has found the solution to it, or even thinks that they found the solution to it, wouldn't do that, primarily because first order pleasures or first order inclinations have no say rationally in whether or not something is right or wrong, at least to a major degree. There has to be some sort of very specific type of thing that would be capable of doing that in the first place, but we don't even know what kind of criteria would establish something like that in the first place. But the whole thing about it is, like, say for instance, if you presented facts to a flat earther, they don't like, but they still disagreed with it. that doesn't thereby mean that the project of epistemology is thusly, or the project of solving the problem of skepticism within epistemology is thereby made redundant and impractical, because the solutions, or at least the attempts to find where exactly the problems really do lie in all of their exhaustive constituent aspects. That is, I would say, is extremely practical, primarily because as soon as we do find whether or not it is possible to solve certain things, gives us major implications regarding our research methodology and our application in general, about how we can go about looking at what is actually important. What is actually important in being able to make moral decisions or to make epistemological decisions, so that we're not just floundering around and looking at what is completely fucking irrelevant. If we drop the task of metaphysics in epistemology and in ethics, we shoot ourselves in the foot practically, because all we do would be to follow what is paradigmatic. And of course, that seems to me to be a pretty dumb decision. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I think your example of the flat earther is interesting, because what you're saying, right, is like, well, even if we come up with really good ways to measure the world, and we find really good tests to figure out whether the world is round or not, and we present them to a flat earther, and they just completely reject it, right? We're like, okay,
sure.
We're not saying that it was impractical to come up with these tests, but that's because we value it, right? We value it. We're not saying it's impractical to get rid of these tests, because we are the ones who value it. You know, we're saying the scientific method is useful for us because we actually give a shit about it. So when we go do these tests,
that's delving into a completely different category of things than what I'm talking about. So if we're going to be equivocating our usage, and I don't mean that in a disparaging logical sense. If we're going to be equivocating our terms in the sense that it can apply to more than one context, or more than one type of context, then it's not very useful to talk past each other when we accidentally use one context instead of the intended one. So when I say value, when I would say value in this kind of context, I would say that it is just simply an essential variable or whatever that happens to make up what descriptively, not prescriptively, but descriptively or stipulatively expresses what the real world is like. Not just to simply say that we value it, but to simply say that this actually does follow logically.
Right. But that's where I wanted to get to, is that I was actually agreeing with you, not disagreeing with you. Was because my point is that these sort of evaluations, these epistemological considerations, are useful for epistemology, whether or not someone agrees with them or not. But because morality has to do with valuing things, right? Then it's a different domain outside of epistemology, because you do in fact have to agree with it for it to have prescriptive power. In order to prescribe something to someone, they would have to accept it. Otherwise, it wouldn't do anything.
Okay, so yeah, for sure. If we're using prescription in a contextualist sense, I do partially agree with that. But the whole idea is how we go about establishing prescriptions in the first place requires stipulation. It requires that undergirding universal kind of a description of how the world really is, or how what is relevant to morality in the real world really is. So we can't actually go about the whole idea of prescribing unless we first establish what it really means. Either categorically or universally, however you want to go about it, what it really means to prescribe, and what exactly we can and cannot quantify over when we are making prescriptive statements. So in the case of metaethics, I think we need to just simply do away with the idea of simply talking about applied cases or normative cases. And of course, I know perspective philosophy. I know he wanted us to talk more towards the applied sense. And I know you probably want to do that as well. But the whole thing about it is, hold on, I just got a message. It kind of just threw me off. Sorry. The whole thing about it is, in order to get to the point of saying that, okay, prescriptions can only happen when we agree with each other, I think it's almost like talking past each other unless we have established a rigid framework of the reference that we're referring to that work together to produce the conclusions that you're stating in the normative framework. We need to get the meta out of the way so we can start to do that kind of stuff. And when it comes to saying that it takes an agreement between individuals to provide a prescription, what do you mean by prescription in that case?
And no, not necessarily that it requires an agreement. So we don't have to find like, let's say I hate chocolate ice cream, but I know you like it. And I know you really like chocolate ice cream. And I went to this place and I heard they have the best. Well, I didn't order it, but I can say to you, you should go there, man. I've heard they have the best in town. You ought to go there, right?
Yeah.
And this is because I know you. So I don't have to agree in the sense that I have to also like chocolate ice cream. Otherwise, I can't tell you, right? So that's not just wanted to know what you mean.
Yeah. Sorry?
But when we're talking about what someone ought to do, it has to be in relation to something that into some sort of second order desire that we know will be the case that they enjoy. We can't just say to someone, here's what you should find pleasurable, right? This is why I'm more of a top-down thinker, why I start in applied ethics, because I think you can't be wrong about the sensations of the world that you experience. Those truly are your sensations. So if I look at something and I feel it's beautiful, you can't just feel, well, why don't you just not find it beautiful? I would say, well, now you're just talking nonsense. This is just who I am.
Right. So the whole problem with that is that it absolutely cannot reach any sort of universals about it. So I don't think it's possible for you to actually hold to any conception of realism if you take that top-down approach, because there'd be no way for you to establish a universal taking that approach in the first place. There'd be no way for you to establish any sort of reliabilistic truthfulness of your framework. And that, yeah, I know you agree. So the whole thing about it is I take a pretty much the opposite approach. We can't, and especially when doing philosophy, because if you're taking a particularistic type approach where you're just simply describing your first order desires and making inferences from them, or your first order preferred principles, then we're talking about a completely different subject. I think if anything, you'd be just simply doing descriptive psychology. So if anything, I'd say that is
in a sense, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I am a descriptivist. The only thing I think I can prescribe is something that's already been described and that I know will lead to another thing. So I think morality is useful in the discussion of figuring out, well, if this descriptively is true about you, here are some sorts of things that we can go about in order to propagate those sorts of things.
And the thing about that is that literally renders your actual usage of prescription as pretty meaningless. It doesn't actually have any weight behind it. It just says, well, if you arbitrarily hold to anything, and anyone could, then you ought to do something to do that. That's just describing that, yes, of course, what is, I think the word would be jurisprudential, but what would be like a definitively exacting of what exactly you want. You got to do certain things. That to me is not morally meaningful in the sense that it's not talking about like what ought you desire, because what ought you desire thing is more foundational and more categorical, which ultimately does in fact produce the framework of morality. Because otherwise you are talking about science, you are talking about descriptive psychology. You're not even talking about phenomenology. If anything, it'd be a bastardized version of phenomenology that attempts to draw inferences, that attempts to draw very meaningless types of inferences.
Well, it's inferences about the phenomenological experience. So it's not like I'm outside of it somehow. Like I'm obviously describing the sensations we feel phenomenologically and making inferences out of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not disregarding it, but yes, I agree. There is a lack of strength in prescriptive power in the way that I go about it, but that's also how I believe the situation that we're in. And so I think it would be better served to talk, well, if this is the state of humanity, if this is how it is, what can we do with this? And I do believe that there is a sort of mimetic sense we can talk about it that's outside of individuals, right? There's a morality that's not, no one's obligated to do, but it's going to do its own thing whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and that'd be the kind of thing I'd be at least a little bit more inclined towards, because the whole thing about it is not all of our immediate desires will actually exact what the object of desire is. Like, say, for instance, if I desired to have a Ferrari in my garage, that doesn't exact. It's not even necessarily perspectively possible for me to exact that kind of desire. So the whole thing about it is being able to exact actualizable desires. I'd say that's an essential component of discussing morality. So,
and
so,
I would
so
also, here's another,
sorry.
here's another component we would probably agree on, is that someone can think they desire something, but they could be completely wrong.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So it's like, look, oh man, I think I would love, like, or let's take this to the veganism sense. Someone might say something like, I don't care if animals die, it's just whatever, it's fine, right? And then you take them to the slaughterhouse and you watch them they watch them do it, and they're just like, you know what? I thought I was okay with this, but witnessing it is a whole different thing, right? I've changed my mind. I don't like this. I don't want this to occur, right? So I think people can come up with ideas, linguistic ideas of their beliefs that are just patently wrong to the sensations, which are more fundamental. The sensation wins, right? It says, well, I'm feeling this guilty. I'm feeling this disgusted.
Yeah.
So obviously what I thought about myself, not true.
Yeah. And that's ultimately, okay, so this definitely does seem to hint towards the framework that I hold to, is that there are in fact indispensables that are necessarily connected to pleasure that can define what types of pleasures you ought to exact that are in your interests, and which ones that aren't in your interests. Like, say, for instance, in the case of the serial killer, like, it may not be in his actual interest to go ahead and kill these people because of his valuation of pleasure as it relates to some sort of indispensable sensational state that does in fact necessarily create negative phenomenological propositional attitude state valuation. So in the case pain, I'll give you an example. Okay, I know there are such things as masochists who actually do positively value pain. But in the case that you aren't capable of dispensing of the idea of negatively valuing pain whenever it arises, that would be one of the grounds for a type of framework that is more universalizable. If you know that what in the future will amount to pain, then you can't say that what you're doing is well-being by simply smoking all those cigarettes or eating a bunch of animal products, or especially doing the keto diet. That's a joke. Anything along that ilk, you can't say that you are adequately or reliably expressing valuation of pleasure in the indispensable sense by performing actions that necessarily lead to things that you cannot dispense of the negative valuation of. Like, say, for instance, extreme suffering through extreme noxious stimuli, through whether that be internal or external, whether it be you getting punched in the face. That'd be a case of some sort of extreme noxious stimuli that you cannot dispense of feeling negative towards, or it amounting to some sort of negative phenomenological experience. That'd be the type of thing that I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, I think we're close in the terms of the way we look at it, but you look at this as indispensables in which we could apply this prescriptivism to, whereas I'm more just coming from the approach as, well, you just, incorrectly described yourself. Because I'm a descriptivist, I'd say, well, you just messed up, right? Like, your linguistic capability to assign inferences to yourself was just wrong, right? Your sensations were first order and they came and told you, you were talking nonsense. But so this thing where you're talking about indispensables of pain and noxious and these sorts of things, I don't think they are indispensable. Now, I think it's really hard.
I'm just trying to give a type of example. I know I don't actually hold to that. I just want to put that.
Yeah. It's hard to get there because it's so hardwired in our brains to find pain bad, but we know we can do it, right? Yeah, somebody can get to that sort of masochistic state. Oh, I love to be demeaned. I love to be made fun of. Ooh, I'm really getting off on it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing. What makes that part of a framework changeable and prone to, I guess, relativism is the fact that it is physical. Because when we're talking about actual sensational states, they're 100% they're 100% just comportments to how exactly the brain is physiologically as it responds to electrochemistry through your actual sense perception, through your actual legitimate physical perception. So because that is actually capable of being changed and swapped around in any given way, I don't think there'd be any really easy to find, I guess, laws that apply across the board that connects types of negative sense perception that does necessarily also connect to our propositional attitude, state, desire. So, like, of course, yeah, that's one of the biggest difficulties, is being able to find these kinds of lawful kinds of connections between propositional attitude states and the real world. So I think the only thing that we can really do is speak, even if it is not complete, is speak from the category of pleasure and simply say that in order to adequately express the positive valuation of positive valuation, which you cannot help but do, you need to be able to do that reliably. And the only way to do that reliably is to do it consistently. And because you are not the only thing that experiences pleasure, other things out there also experience pleasure. So in order to adequately express or reliably move towards the valuation of that category is to also value other people, and to also attempt to at least look for what exactly are they not capable of dispensing of when it comes to, say, for instance, pleasure or negative sense stimuli like pain, stuff like that. Trying to actively look for these kinds of indispensables, I think, is the proper project of applied ethics, if anything. So that's ultimately what I'm trying to get at. It's not complete, and I totally understand that. But go ahead.
Like, I do understand where you're trying to go with it. It's just that I don't see a route to get there. It's just like let's say I take a hypothetical with because I feel like a lot of value expression is power locked, right? Like there's reasons I can't just go out and murder people. It's because people will murder me back, right? So I'm very power locked. But let's say I'm granted by Zeus the ability to be invulnerable, and I have superhuman powers. Now I'm not power locked at all, sure. Right? So if I'm the serial killer, I can just find pleasure in just murdering people. Maybe I'll only murder so many so you guys can keep breeding and I can continue murdering you. But
if I may interrupt, one of the viewers has asked if we could bring it back to veganism rather than just a human example of humans murdering humans.
Yes, please.
And also, just to throw it in there, what you're describing there, Shadow, is actually what Epicurus would have called aponia. I think the state of being innately content, basically unchangeable. He describes this about the gods, and he says basically, what can you offer the gods? He's like, how would you change the gods' mind? He's like, well, they are uninfluenceable because they are innately above us. So he's like, don't fear the gods, because if the gods wanted to do something to you, well, they're gonna fucking do it. So
that's entirely the case. Like, part of moral discussion is to realize that we are locked in power with each other, and if it wasn't the case, things would be a whole lot different. If one of us was the god, then you can't offer anything unless you're appealing to something that they want, right? Maybe they want your approval, then you can leverage that, and that's something you can work with. But if they don't care,
that could actually really well segue into one of the principles that defines my framework. Have you guys ever heard of the ought implies can principle?
Yeah.
Okay. So So in objective consequentialism or in prospective consequentialism, there absolutely needs to be an ought implies can principle in place in order for you to be able to say that that you're capable of being moral in the first place, because otherwise it may just all be beyond you and you won't even be able to know whether or not you are capable of being moral or immoral, and that could actually just lead you down to error theory. So the whole thing about it is acting moral or applying your morality, I think, is in and of itself, or even learning about morality, I think is in and of itself confined to the ought implies can principle about what we are capable of knowing. So whether or not we are capable of knowing the solution to the very problems I'm kind of trying to bring up and draw light to, and the type of framework that I'm attempting to kind of move towards, I think that in and of itself is confined by the ought implies can principle. And I think the same thing even applies to epistemology. We can only really work from what we're capable of having access to that do comprise these types of frameworks. Like, say, for instance, scientific knowledge is very different from philosophical knowledge. It's more based on well-foundedness than it is based on necessary and sufficient justification. So
where are you on free will then?
I'm a hard determinist.
Okay, so me too. So a lot of the cans we would agree aren't doable under that idea.
Yes.
Okay. Let's go back to veganism, because apparently the
Yes,
audience wants us to talk about veganism.
Yeah.
Oh, so I guess we could talk about, like, I can definitely understand how from your framework how you go to veganism, because you've got this categorical understanding of pleasure. Now, there's two ways I would go about disagreeing. Is one, that I don't have to agree with that category, and number two, I might even argue that the category doesn't apply to certain animals, because I don't think that the vegan idea of sentience is correct.
Okay, so what exactly is your conception of consciousness? What is your conception of sentience? What's your conception of sapience? Like, what makes those things what they are?
So, like, okay, so sentience is a bit of an old word that's sort of out of use in neurology and in philosophy these days. So it's mostly revolves around consciousness. And currently, I'm a higher order theorist dispositionalist.
Okay.
So that's to say that I think a conscious state is one that you have a disposition to be able to have higher order thoughts about. And the reason that I'm in this position is because I agree with a lot of philosophers that any behavior can either be conscious or unconscious. That seems to be derivable from our own nature. So simply witnessing a behavior will never tell us anything. I think the whole brain, just because we have a brain and central nervous system and that gives us consciousness does not mean that all brains and nervous systems give consciousness. That would just be an error.
For sure.
That's affirming the consequent.
Yeah, that's right.
So like, and we have these sorts of tests on people who have like blind sight. Blind sight is a condition where someone doesn't have a phenomenological experience of vision, but they can still use vision, right? You ask them, reach out and grab this ball, they can do it, but they can't see it. They don't have a representation of it. So obviously consciousness is a representational state. It's not merely the data itself. The data is usable, whether represented or not.
Yes, I 100% agree. Would that make you an epiphenomenalist?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, so that's basically what I am. But I do think there are in fact there are perfectly usable inductive arguments and inferences to be used, because when we only have access to limited data, and due to the fact that we do not have access to the private experiences of each agent, we can only refer back to what is the next best set of data that we do have access to. Now, logical empiricism, for example, of course, I know it's a pretty old thing, and it's pretty much been done away with paradigmatically. But in the case of, say, for instance, resorting to the next best observational terminology to define whether or not something is in fact a particular type of thing, like, say, for instance, with acid, like using a type of strip that turns red whenever you dip your the piece of paper into the liquid, and that determines whether or not it's like acidic or alkaline. Of course, like that runs into problems where it's like you dipping it into tomato sauce, or dipping it into alkaline paint, it comes out red and it's alkaline, or it's just turning red because the thing it's projecting its property onto that piece of paper. Like there are problems with that type of approach. But when it comes down to it, what does comprise our conscious state of being the case? Like take it all the way back to even a Descartes. What was the Descartes? Yeah, I think it was Descartes. Like, I think therefore I am. Was that Descartes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the whole idea is really that we exist as our consciousness. We exist as our awareness. Now, what makes that awareness what it is?
Mm-hmm.
That's an essential question to being able to say, okay, what else has these kinds of properties? But in order to be able to do that in the first place, we need to sort of translate that language into observable terms, and that's why we use brain and central nervous system, because we are that existence of representational awareness. That is a representational type of existence. So it's representational through our senses and through our processing of the information that our senses take in. So what does that necessitate? A brain and central nervous system. So that's why so it's an inductive argument. It is more of an
But
inductive argument.
That,
So
that
whenever
is, we're
these
just going
types,
just yeah,
go
but
ahead.
I think that sort of inductive argument is just the affirming the consequence of inductive argument is just too weak. It's not
Yeah.
worth commenting on. Now I say, okay, sure, that could lead you to agnosticism, right? Well, I don't know if something has a phenomenological experience or not. I should remain ignorant, and then maybe you can go from the principle of charity, right? You can say, well, since I don't know, I'm going to treat this with a cautionary approach. Fine,
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
right?
And
But I think we're farther along than that. Personally, examples like blind sight show us that, like, vision isn't required to be representational, so we can say, well, now we know that it's a possibility that animals are sort of this sort of blind sight. So then we start asking ourselves, well, what was it like for us to become phenomenological? Okay. So I'm gonna
Yeah, he said be right back there.
well, if I make my point and he's not here, then
I know. I think you probably just got called away. We'll just stop for a second, and if anyone's got any questions for Shadow in the meantime, half of this has been me just trying not to talk.
are you dying over there, Lewis? Are you just...
Oh, this is killing us. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, there's parts where he's answering, and I'm just like, Darren, please, please. Like, he's talking, he just let you get away with saying something like, oh, when we talk about human nature, it's like, what was that about human nature?
All right, do we have any questions? Does anybody want to ask me anything?
People were wondering, I think it was some questions about the phenomenological experience, and someone was asking, like, why you aren't vegan, like what separates you and me with our positions in regards to animals. But I guess me answer would be Watchy's argumentation against Darren. To be entirely honest with you, I think fundamentally, have you agreed? Like, it feels like, because of the way the terminologies went in this, it's hard to pin you down too much. But have you agreed, it seems, on epistemic realism?
I'm all over the place with metaethics. That's why I don't even adopt a stance at this point.
This is the thing. It just feels like, it's like, well, okay, so it seems like you both agree that truth, though, like, truth isn't subjective, at least. So
yeah.
But God, you're back. You're back. Okay, so let's talk about what we have actually, just for the people watching, so we know where we are actually, so we can quickly say, like, this is where we are, this is where we're heading. So far, what I've gathered is that you've both agreed that truth isn't subjective. Now, Shadow sits on the point where he says, well, we both agree in evaluations, except you have placed it in pleasure into two categories. First order and second order pleasure, and you've said that second order pleasure is my ability to prescribe in relation, like, make propositions about my future behaviors. This would be like ethics, right? Ability to govern me actions towards the future.
I would say that's an incidental entailment. I would say that actually does necessarily define it, and that's the thing. I think there's actually definitively a problem about defining second order categories like that. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, like, so you would say that, like, so why would you say that? Wait a minute. Why do we? Oh, okay. I don't want to end up in the goddamn debate.
Well, should we go back to our previous point, because we're just going to get derailed back to metaethics again?
Yeah. I guess I just kind of want to know. Really, I want us to bring back to an animal. This is what I want. I want you to explain to me. So, for example, right now, I see Shadow saying that he values himself. But he hasn't explained why he doesn't value an animal. And your view, I think, needs fleshed out a little bit more when it comes to applied ethics as well, Darren. So I'll let you get back to that point. Just keep veganism, animals, and those two things I've mentioned in mind, if that's okay.
Excellent, yeah.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to finish my phenomenological point, because I was going to say that if you accept that generally people do not have phenomenological experiences when they are younger, or don't remember them, right? So you could say, well, perhaps we do, but our memories aren't there to keep them. Or perhaps it's the case that they just don't exist yet and they're developed later.
Yep.
Then we have a place to say, well, it is possible a certain level of development is required in order to create that representational state. And that's more the position where I come from, whereas I think it develops on our theory of self, which is something that humans, develop later. A lot of the memories that are epistemic or episodic that we start developing come around the time that we do develop a certain theory of mind, which is to say, I think we make a representation of what we generally are, and that is somewhat of a, it's not a linguistic category, but it's a cognitive category, an understanding of ourself, and then the phenomenological experience is relating things to that theory of self. It's dispositional, so it doesn't have to be, I have to think I'm picking up this ball right now, but it's like what they call a global workspace. So it's an area where we could say things like that. We have the capacity to. And that's what starts the phenomenological experience. Now, because animals don't tend to get to those, modular linguistics that we have, and they don't tend to develop the same sort of theories of mind. Not all animals. I do think some animals are probably capable of this, but I would say that a lot of animals can't make that global workspace due to the uncomplexity that they have, that they aren't able to generate these phenomenological states.
Okay, so let me quickly respond to that. So I think it's very important to be able to split up our phenomenological experiences into two separate categories. And once again, we're doing categorization. Yes, this is metaphysics, guys. This isn't just pure linguistics. This isn't just reasoning from what other people were saying these specific words mean. What really defines experience is split between two categories, presentational and representational. I would say what makes sapiences sapient, rather than just simply being sentient, is the fact that they're capable of representational experience and a very specific type of presentational experience. Now, I would say that animals, okay, this is typically what I go by. I'm not saying that I'm not exactly completely prepared to defend this. Please don't attack me. So, but I would say that that animals have a type of presentational experience that they're fully aware of, and this does constitute their awareness. Is the fact that they have these types of presentational experiences, which is through the senses, so sense experience and self-awareness. A second to that would be, say, for instance, presentational experience of logical, mathematical, or linguistic operation. So knowing that 2 + 2 = 4, that if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates is mortal, etc. All that kind of stuff. Or even the laws of logic. That's a specific type of presentational experience. That's separate from this other type of presentational experience. That's just it's if anything, it's more vivid because it's 100% attached to the real world, and the real world directly comprises all of our meaningful expressions in that second category of presentational experiences. But then it completely comprises our representational experiences, which tends to be what we do when we're trying to speak logically, linguistically, or mathematically about the world. We're using our representational experiences to be able to operate over in the logical, mathematical, linguistic sense. Animals just don't have those other two categories. At least that's why I work by, and that's primarily I would say indicative. Like if we're going to use that to ground our be ontologically committed to when we start to talk about, like, say, for instance, behaviorism, determining whether or not they're experiencing suffering and stuff like that, I would say that would make the behaviorist framework even stronger, because they can't have interfering factors from say, for instance, preconceived notions or ulterior motives about expressing. They just express. They straight up express exactly how how exactly their sensory presentational experience is. So because they cannot help it, because they don't have those extra modes of experiencing. And therefore, I think the behaviorist approach to determining whether or not animals are worth taking into consideration morally, and whether or not they do in fact experience suffering, I think is made at least a little bit more strong, just by virtue of the fact that they don't have those other two modes of experience. But it doesn't mean that they don't have that type of consciousness, the consciousness of presentational experience, awareness of senses, and awareness that the fact that, you've got senses and that comprises your awareness, therefore you're aware of yourself. So therefore you're aware of your own awareness. That, I think, in of itself, that reflects that cyclical kind of mechanism, I would say that's what constitutes consciousness in the first place. So your view... Sorry?
Your view sounds very much like the ones put forth called, I think it's by Edelman, by primary and secondary consciousness, where primary is a very raw at-hand experience of sensory information, and it doesn't have to go beyond that, right? It is representational of simply your experiences in the moment of things like pain, sight, those sorts of sensations, and that is enough to call consciousness. Now, my problem with that is that things like blind sight, I find, just show that this doesn't have to be the case at all. All these sort of sensations could be all unconscious, right?
Yeah. Okay. So that's one of the problems with logical empiricism in the first place, is that turning those kinds of things into observational terms is going to be some gap. That's the problem of undetermination. So the whole thing about it is we are, I think, perspectively limited to underdetermination when it comes to these kinds of things, because it's not exactly easy to translate or to convert phenomenological terms into natural terms. I
100% agree. It's just a pain in the ass field to study that needs, and there's a lot of problems in it with those who study, because there's a lot of pure neurological approaches and pure behaviorist approaches that never take philosophy of mind into consideration and end up saying a bunch of stupid crap that they're unjustified in saying, and it drives me bonkers. But
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Like actually that could actually take me down like the route of me explaining exactly what I want to do with my university life. Holy crap. Like honestly, like most of the time when it comes to scientific disciplines, it's because of that stupid this stupid culture of philosophy is dead. Therefore it's dispensed of without thinking the fact that science is in fact a type of applied philosophy. Without understanding that which undergirds it, which is philosophy, you can't properly do it or reliably do it in a way that does exact its goals, or to exact what the hell it's trying to research.
Yeah, or even trying to like elucidate what its goals even are. Like there's so many people are researching consciousness without defining it or understanding what it is they're supposed to be talking about to begin with.
Exactly. But hold on, that actually can go into a thing called, like, and this is just a recent, probably recent, I'm not sure. Have you heard of a thing called the 3 grades of involvement of metaphysics in conceptual analysis? Oh, we'll branch us back to veganism soon. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a segue.
Can you see just leaning closer to the mic?
Have you heard of the 3 grades of involvement that metaphysics has in conceptual analysis?
No, my metaphysics is fairly weak.
Oh, okay, that's perfectly fine. So basically, what most of the time it is that people are really doing when they're doing the sciences is what they call the 2nd grade of involvement. It's like, say for instance, you know what the shape ellipse is, without having to define it mathematically or to define it linguistically. You don't actually need to do. You already know that's what it is, and that's the thing that we're trying to study and we're trying to figure out. That's literally the same thing that they're doing with mind and consciousness. And to a degree, that's also what I'm doing when I'm talking about ultimately these types of universal objective types of prescriptions. I know what I'm talking about. It's just I haven't reached the point where I've reached what they call the 3rd grade of involvement of metaphysics in conceptual analysis, where we actually do explicate necessary and sufficient conditions or biconditional that does like establish the true existence or the true essential nature of what the hell we're talking about or quantifying over. So that I would say that's probably what defines how I have approached this debate in the first place. So I do apologize because I don't like it myself. But it's the best I could do right now.
So to bring this back, I would say that one of the stronger points that would be for this sort of primal consciousness would be if we were forming episodic memories as babies. So you would have to at least show that part of the human condition is that once these primary conditions are set into place, we would also have conscious experience. Now you can say, well, we do, but we just don't remember them. And that is a possibility, but I think that's a weak explanation because given a baby's memory capacity, we actually learn incredibly fast. So you'd be going to say, well, we're just dispensing of those sorts of memories. Well, why? Why would that be the case? Like, why did we make a separate category of memories and decide I don't want any of these? So I find it's a stronger explanation to say, no, it's consciousness is the thing that develops. Those primary conditions aren't sufficient. They come about later. And I would say that, certain animals who share certain capabilities with us once we start our phenomenological experience are very likely phenomenological themselves, or anything even remotely close. But there are a lot of differences along the sliding scale of what we call animals.
And that's the thing, though, because like when we do that kind of approach where it is the second grade of involvement, we need to be grounded on the fact that we are talking about the same thing, first and foremost, and second of all, that it is a thing instead of just some arbitrary selection of things that may not even be relevant. We need to restrict our purview of concern only to that which is relevant to what the hell we're talking about. The referent itself, not just simply say that this is some polymorphous thing that will change over time. We're just trying to understand this general nature. We don't even know what the hell we're talking about if we do that. We need to actually establish that we are referring to the same thing. And in order for it to be the same thing that we're talking about across the board, it needs to be univocal. It needs to be the thing that we're referring to. It can't just simply be a possible group, a possible purview of things, and we may be talking about this or we may be talking about that. No, we're definitively talking about a single thing. We cannot afford to say that it has this kind of continuous gradiential nature with other possible concepts. It needs to be this univocal thing, and it may have subcategorical descriptors or prescriptors or stipulators, but it's still univocally that thing.
I agree. We're in a big puddle of shit when it comes to consciousness.
And that's the thing. When you perform conceptual analysis on your own awareness, it does break down into presentational and representational experiences. So in order for it to be a consciousness in the first place, it needs to contain at least one of those one of those types of experiences. And whatever facilitates that experience, we just need to understand what exactly is that kind of experience in the first place. If the experience is sense, what's it called? There's a sensational state in the mind. What that relates to is your physical senses. So we can say, okay, well, physical senses as it is. So the central nervous system, which actually does relate the physical senses to whatever processes these senses and has this experience of these senses, which happens to be the brain. We can say that whatever has a brain and these kinds of peripheral nervous system is thusly capable, at least capable, of having those types of presentational experience. That's what I'm getting at.
That's where I would disagree, because the capability.
Please understand, it's not deductive; it's inductive.
Yeah. Okay, guys. I'm just gonna butt in right now because I see an opportunity. So, me and Shadow have discussed this before, and I think we're pretty much at the same point. And I swear to God, if you can prove that consciousness exists in another being, definitively, I will give you both a Nobel Prize as we speak.
Yeah, we all know we can't.
Yeah, and so we know that we're exhausting. We right now are exhausting the limits of human knowledge.
Yeah.
So
now, okay. So listen, Lewis, we're doing induction to the best explanation, and if you're just shutting me down on my explanation,
no. I think the problem is here. This is what I'm going to say. I think the problem is that you're in a situation where Darren's saying that there is definitely an opportunity that an animal could be conscious, and you're going to say that, well, actually, given the evidence.
Vegans are hiding behind doubt so much, because every time I have a conversation about this with a vegan, they're always like, well, you can't really know. You can't definitively know. And I never said that I could, but I think I can make strong inductive arguments.
I'm not in this, okay? I'm just saying that this is this is exhaustive.
You're butting in here.
I'm just saying, guys, there's only so much we can be. I mean, what we know so far is that you both agree that consciousness can emanate from a central nervous system. Now, so far, I think, Shadow, you're not saying that you're saying that it could be an emergent property of the central nervous system partaken through language, or at least kind of through linguistic ability,
through a theory of mind.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be linguistic. I'm undecided on that.
Now, what? We'll get onto that at some point. But anyway, weirdly enough, I think I have a worse view than you on that. But the
I
point
know. Your arguments almost sound like you're supporting me sometimes whenever I hear you talk about it.
I know it's weird. Anyway, but the thing is that I think what Darren's arguing is this part, I would argue, almost like with a ready-to-hand state, where he's saying that this is senses, and what they can have is almost an intuitive reality where they're aware of what is around them, but and what stimuli is actually happening within their mind, but they're not able to make what would be higher level higher level consciousness. Now, this is literally the same debate me and you have, and out of past experience, we've not gotten anywhere, and I don't know anyone who has.
Well,
so what I would like, Darren can make arguments better than me. I'm fully confident on that, but I want to see. Really, I just want to bring this back to whether this would affect our decision-making process, because Shadow, if let's say you did,
right. If I did grant a primary sort of at-hand experience, would I even value it? No, I wouldn't.
Yeah,
you already know I would.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you do defeat Shadow on this, let's say you just managed to get him to admit, oh yeah, actually that's right. They do have an at-hand experience. He's gonna go, I don't give a shit.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Lewis. You know me enough to know that I would say that.
So I just don't want to be stuck on this for too long, because you're going to get stuck on something else in about 20 minutes. So
Lewis isn't incorrect on that one. I would say that, well, okay, maybe this at-hand experience does in fact exist, but like my consideration is only ever established to those who have conceptualizations of themselves anyways. So we're looking at the secondary consciousness for me to care to begin with.
Okay, so just to bring this back, I'd actually like to really introduce a kind of a crux type description of my argument, that ultimately it boils down, in the applied sense, to the precautionary principle. And the reason it boils down to that is because the only thing that's capable of facilitating desire is a type of, or facilitating the existence of there being a desire, or the subsistence, whatever way you want to put it, because I know it's not a physical material existence, it's a different substantive existence. Okay, so whatever is capable of facilitating desire happens to be consciousness or sentience, whatever way you want to put it, and whatever is capable of facilitating sentience, which can be conceptually analyzed over and reduced to, is physical senses, central nervous system, which facilitates electrochemical impulses that connect and refer a processing system, our brain, to those senses in whatever given sense biologically is, I guess, evolutionarily advantageous. Like, say, for instance, it's not advantageous to sustain damage and not continue the biochemical evolution of humanity. So that could be like just a type of causal, a descriptive explanation of why exactly certain types of sense perception or experiences negative, and which ones experiences positive. That's beside the point. Okay, so back to the precautionary principle. What gives us a good reason to, if we are to consider sentience to be an essential component of what comprises that which is morally relevant, then ultimately, because via the process of just inductively reasoning about it, because brain, central nervous system, and sense stimuli, or sense perceivers and receptors, is ultimately at least the general category that we can know definitely facilitates our consciousness, then we have a good reason to believe that it's possible, or that it's probable, highly probable, that that using that criteria, the brain, central nervous system, and sense receptors, is a good enough argument to say that these things are in fact morally relevant as well, primarily because they are also capable of facilitating the exact same thing that we indispensably value, which is our own desires. That would be my precautionary principle. That's ultimately the crux of my applied ethic, or my I guess the tail end of my normative ethics. But I'm not, like, I am interested, but I'm not too interested in that, because ultimately these kinds of things beg the question: And I think it is in our own best interest to really, really flesh out from the bottom up, not from the top down, because that doesn't have the capacity to reach the true grounds, but from the true grounds upwards. So from our acquaintance and knowledge by description upwards, from our own mental states, not our first order mental content, but our mental states like desire, being able to in order to be able to reliably produce first order desires, we need to understand that what reliably produces the content of our desire, which is pleasure, requires consistency. It requires a uniformity, because there is a uniformity of nature. That's an inductive argument, but that's beside the point. But because we're not capable of valuing, to dispense of our value of pleasure, it is literally against our own best interests to negate the pleasure or to negate the well-being of any other species that we can know is possible of having these experiences as well. So that even applies if we're in the matrix, because it's an inductive argument. Because what if all these other
saying a lot of things, I don't know how to respond to it. Just too many points.
This is
Are we making closing arguments, or what's going on?
This is the crux of my position, because if this debate is, or discussion, if this discussion is approaching its end, I might as well just get my position on the table and let people know.
Well, then I'll do that. I'll do the same after you're done.
Yeah. So yeah, ultimately, the argument is to apply itself inductively, because there's no way to apply ourselves to the material world without using induction. We can't deductively know the true nature of the material world until we know its true foundations. So that's the thing. That's ultimately the approach I take to this general subject. It's fucking difficult, guys. It is so difficult, and people make it out to be super easy by using these kinds of arbitrary axioms to ground their framework. And if you step outside of it, you've lost the debate type thing. That kind of stuff pisses me off, because it's not taking philosophy as seriously as it should. Because in order to act and perform in your own best interest, whatever those interests may be, we don't even know that yet. I don't even know that yet. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to find out. What's in our own best interests? To act unreliably towards truth, literally, there's no possibility for it to be in your best interest. So the whole thing about it is we need to take this very metaphysical subject very fucking seriously before we can even try to do normative and applied ethics. But of course we can do for pragmatic reasons, but that's besides the point. But yeah, that's the crux of my position, and this what exactly my purpose is with this whole discussion, the subject of ethics. Go ahead.
Okay, so these are basically closing statements. I'll give mine, I guess.
Pretty much.
Okay, yeah. So metaethically, I feel like the prescriptive power that we're looking for and that we wish to have, I don't think it can be found, because one, I think we're stuck in determinism anyways. So even if you said to someone what their desire should have been, it inevitably will be the case based on what it is. Now, of course, we could influence later and attempt to move towards things, but that's only to the capability that human brains have the capacity to change. So if a capacity of a desire doesn't have such plasticity to be able to change to something, then I would say that power to suggest something wouldn't work. But I think we have more suggestive power when it comes to things that are descriptive of that person, something that we know that they desire, and we're able to make statements that entail to it already. Though I still think morality has descriptive power by showing people how they can possibly be ignorant of their own sensations and ignorant of the consequences of certain actions later down the line that will lead to sensations that they didn't realize could happen, so that there's some sort of epistemic value when it comes to speaking of morality, even in a framework that shows it's all just being arbitrarily decided by experiential factors that we have no control over whatsoever. I think that this applies to things, not necessarily brain and nervous system, because I'm more of a functionalist. I would say that, you know, if a robot is able to do the same sorts of things that we can, which is to say make a representational state and understand itself as existing, I wouldn't say they even need sensory organs. They don't need to have a sensation of pain. All they have to do is have any sort of evaluative system that applies to a sense of self. So if they understand what they are, and then they understand aspects of themselves as wanting and not wanting, I would say you already have an evaluative system. And this would be different than something I would say like a chess AI, which has evaluative states for moves, but doesn't really have a sense of self and doesn't even know it exists. So who cares? And this is sort of my approach to animals, where I think they don't have that certain sort of theory of mind that makes a relevant representational state. And so my approach towards animals is different. Well, that's not to say all animals, because I actually do think things like elephants and dolphins are very likely candidates for these sort of capabilities, and probably, you know, other things that are very close to our evolutionary capacity. But when you start going farther down the line, I think it just becomes more and more apparent these capabilities don't exist. So that's sort of my approach. I think we are sort of just power locked. In sorts of value expression, but I do think moral progress is a thing that is outside of any individual person and outside of prescriptivism. It's just going to happen because whatever is the strongest way of value expression will tend to propagate, just like evolution. Like good traits propagate, good ideas propagate. That's memetics. And I think moral progress will take the future in that sort of way. It's just up to us to notice it or not.
Right. So that was intense. Right, I'm going to Q&A you both a little bit. Just a little bit, if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Right. First, I'd like to say, Shadow, that sounded a little bit like me there. I heard that moral progress. You know, it's almost like I'm getting somewhere. It sounds a little bit like Hegel. You know, it's the pressure of history.
Do you feel like you're chipping me down here, Lewis?
Somewhat.
I think we both have influences on each other.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's hard not to in these cases. Just out of curiosity, how far away do you think mine and Darren's arguments are from each other?
All right. What, did it go silent?
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying, how far do you think mine and Darren's arguments are from each other? Considering that we'll all argue for the same thing.
Well, you have a lot more in linguistics.
I do spend a lot of time in linguistics.
Yeah, where I don't hear Darren talk so much about linguistics. He's more got these sort of categorical understandings. I don't see. You don't argue. You argue for the nature of what language is and how it describes in order to move forward. So I do think you guys sort of have the same conclusion, but you go at slightly different routes.
There are no problems of metaphysics, only of language. You know.
Oh, that's debatable. Yeah,
just do a bit of Wittgenstein, are you there? You know.
Oh, boy,
right.
Yeah. We can talk about him.
Okay, let's talk about your view, Darren. So, right, since we did talk about phenomenology, and you know what, we're talking about. I think it's fair. I don't know if Shadow would agree, but I think it's fair to operate a principle of charity upon anyone's judgment making towards animals. Basically, because one, I think you're taking a place of authority. And in that, you are the one making the assertion, and therefore the burden of proof is on your position to prove said assertion that the animal is, in fact, not conscious. Now, Shadow may disagree, but since it doesn't actually affect your case, since you wouldn't even care if they did have a ready-to-hand experience anyway, we'll just take that as being the case for now. So, given that an animal even does, or even a human, or anyone else, does have a value experience that goes beyond mine. Now, I, as Shadow has said, I am forced to evaluate my own experience. I am necessitated to evaluate my own experience. Why should I evaluate their experience? Why should I value another human, another animal, so on?
Okay, so the reason that you value your own experience is because your experience happens to contain that thing that necessitates positive valuation. It's really simple. It's a categorical thing.
This is the thing. So Shadow said, and I think this is, fair. which come first, the categorical understanding of the evaluation or the evaluation?
Okay, so like ultimately, it probably I'd probably at the moment go for a simultaneity type thing. So
Which
I would say
at the
that
same time,
in order for these things to emerge in the first order sense, they have to be emergences of the second order category. They happen to be contingencies of that second order category. So as soon as they occur in the individual now also has second order that second order categorical sense as well. So I'd say that's simultaneous.
right.
It's like say for instance, regularities and necessitarian laws of nature. What comes first? The necessitarian laws of nature that govern that existence exists, or does the things that exist come first? Like what? Like that's the exact same type of question. I would say that it's relatively meaningless, if anything. But the whole thing about it is, if one is universal and it applies across the board, I think that does take precedence.
I think you're not wrong with saying that it's simultaneous.
It needs more conceptualization for sure.
It's involved in conceptualization, which is why I would have went down linguistics. But Shadow, I don't know if you noticed, he said pre-linguistic. Understand? And I know it's just slipped that in there, Shadow.
Yes.
I would have said it came along with the conception of self. Now, I think Shadow wanted to say that it pre-existed a conception of self. And I think this is almost Nietzschean. You would say that what we are is describing ourselves rather than being able to evaluate ourselves, that the evaluation pre-existed the said description of the evaluation. Now, you see, it's, I know, I've seen you do that. Now, given that, okay, now I think, is that something that you would argue against? Would you say that the evaluation comes at the same time? You see, it seems like because I think the issue is if you were to say that the evaluation, and I don't know if this is deliberate, but if the evaluation comes at the same time, that the evaluation of oneself comes at the same time as linguistic conceptualization, well, then animals can't evaluate themselves because they have no concept of self. Funny. And at the same time, if you were to say that, then animals clearly don't have moral value because they're incapable of having value. On the other hand, if it pre-exists your ability to describe said universals, generalizations, then what he would say is that the problem is of the categorization, I think, not necessarily of the and it's not, and you do not need to value the categorization. And what you need to value in the first place is that what you are necessitated to value by nature.
So, Lewis, is this our Q&A time, or is this
this is our Q&A time? So
yeah,
I'm
doesn't
asking
sound like
how
questions.
No,
this sounds more like statements to me.
I'm just wondering how you would approach something like that.
How would you approach this really long opinion I'm going to give?
Well, it's not an opinion, because it's not something that I would actually argue against that. You know that I don't take this. I'm just trying to represent your position, I think, in the most fleshed out way I can. Would you say that was a good represent?
I agree with you. It does become a problem if you start saying that linguistics is the start of evaluation, but then you talk about animals as if they have moral value, like because they're trying to make evaluations. You sort of run yourself into a pickle of saying, well, they can't do this, but I also value their capability to do this. It doesn't really make any sense. So you have to at least split, evaluations pre-linguistic, and then say that there are different sorts, after you gain the scope.
I'm seeing a problem here. Okay, so the constant bringing up of the idea of linguistic, pre-linguistic, and evaluation. So evaluation to me sounds fundamentally linguistic. Am I correct?
No.
Okay, so what do you mean by evaluation then?
Well, okay. So, I mean, if it's necessarily entailed within your definition of, evaluation, that it's a linguistic thing, then obviously it's just going to be tautological. But if we're talking about like deciding whether to move towards or run away from, or those sorts of decisions, like what kind of stimuli that I find pleasurable, then we would say you can do this pre-linguistically.
Yeah.
So yeah, evaluation doesn't mean conceptualization.
Yeah.
Well, I
Okay,
think in metaphysical terms, I would say it would be the appreciation of quantities. Would you like, for example, like something that was, for example, good and bad in that respect, it would be a quantitative experience. Oh, well, a qualitative experience, actually.
Yeah. I've never heard, just a second, I've never heard anyone use evaluation in the sense that you guys are using it, because whenever one, like, at least in colloquial senses, whenever one uses the word evaluation, it tends to mean that they're conceptualizing over things. So if we're to say that conceptualizing over things comes at the same time as the existence of these first order phenomenological experiences, that literally doesn't make any sense. I don't see how that would even.
Well, this is what I would say, is that like we're making those evaluations subconsciously anyways. It's not your linguistics doing it. There's no free will sense of you doing this that supersedes it. It's just that you're coming to be aware of it. You're putting it into a modular language.
There's a more broad sense in which to say evaluation. So so that I think that would probably be very important to clear up, because whenever, and I think this is where you guys could actually get someone may be confused and attempt to disagree with you about this entire situation just based on that usage of the selection of that word as one of the operators in your sentences. Like, because someone, of course, they're going to probably mix that up, use that with just like an explicit representational linguistic evaluation. So I think
that the important thing I would distinguish here is that, because you were actually going to go down the philosophy of mind route at one point, and it was kind of about this. And there was a point when I wanted to bring up, and I think it's important, is our understanding of the world abstracted or is it constructed?
Abstracted.
Right. Okay, we disagree. Shadow. Shadow.
Yeah, I believe in objective philosophical representationism.
Okay.
That's my meta-philosophy commitment.
Right. Shadow?
What's the question?
Abstraction or construction, conceptually?
Well,
you see, this is the hardest thing, just getting Shadow to agree on any of these positions. He's like, well, they both have merit.
Yeah, that's sort of that's sort of where I was about to go. I was just like,
okay, well, you see,
depends on the sense in which you're asking the question.
Yeah, I'm talking about humans, right? Because I would say that animals typically act on abstraction, tabula rasa understandings of the world based upon the fundamental understanding of intuitive experiences. That is, like, for example, their ability to. I think a good example is actually a goose can at birth can distinguish between the silhouette of a hawk and the silhouette of another goose on the clouds. Right now, I would say that information must have arisen from the genetically or
It just
evolutionary
that sort of thing into the brain. That's how it constructs the brain.
Yeah. So these understandings, I would say, are given to the goose. And this is what it means to be a goose. This is an at-hand experience, but a constructive experience. Well, arguably, we'll get onto that. Yeah, but the constructive experience is something that I would argue is linguistic and not is far more complex and starts to replace those concepts in which we are given, and that's how we can end up changing something from being pain, for example, to being pleasure. And we'll talk a lot of philosophy of mind. I'll happily tutor you both in it sometime,
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yes, just in case you ever need us to. But the whole point is, what I'm getting at is, I think this is fundamentally something that you just need to discuss, because and it's actually interesting that Darren says abstracted. Because if I was half expecting you to say constructed right now from the position, like I was like, whew, he's gonna have to argue this one, right? Because if he's saying that it's pre-linguistic, then you're gonna have to explain how you can intuit what is pain or pleasure and so on. But that would have been a case, I think, for Darren's position, where he said you simply could not understand without the proper categorizations these first order desires in the first place. You don't know what you want. You see, this is the position I would make. Because Darren, you said, if I may, you said produce first order desires. Now, Shadow, if I'm right, you would just hate that. The idea of producing a first order desire is just disgusting.
Especially through linguistics, that would drive me nuts.
Yeah. I think I probably misworded it, and that's probably why there's because I do see issue with that. Yeah, you don't produce first order desires; they simply are pre-linguistic.
So linguistic helps you relate them, and it also helps you make a temporal template of what to do in the future. But it doesn't produce the things that you're working with to begin with.
You see, this is what I wanted to make sure that we're kind of flesh out, because when you said produce first order desires, I could see an issue there, and it's something I wanted to kind of corner you on there, and just trying to make sure that we weren't going to end up in sort of a lack of understanding between each other there.
Yeah, we don't want to talk past it.
Yeah, exactly. So,
well, okay, I want to get to some of these people's questions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Go ahead. The people are asking. Somebody asked me, would you give moral consideration to elephants and other animals that you may think have a theory of mind? For example, if elephants would be farmed instead of pigs or cows and so on. Yes, that is my position.
Somebody also said, would you say that a 4-month-old baby, would they be able to have a pain or pleasure experience?
They would not be able to have a phenomenological experience of pain. Obviously, they can use pain as information in their brain to make decisions. I would not call it phenomenological.
Yeah, for sure, because it's okay. I don't know where you're coming from, but like I would personally call it phenomenological because of the categorization I use for phenomenological is literally it's not you don't have to be logically or reflectively or linguistically aware of your sensational presentational experience. I think all you need is because you exist, the I exists as an awareness, and that awareness exists through propositional attitude states if you're sapient, and it just simply exists through sensational experience if you're just simply sentient. So
of course, Shadow's
we're modified
by doubt.
We're modified by our ideas of consciousness to begin with to sort of answer that question.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be a problem unless you can say it as well. Like you would, I think the only reason that you're as well, the good thing is that you would say that through abstraction they can understand that experience tabula rasa. Like they can understand, perceive those sensations. It's given to them. It's hardwired in. Okay. Cool.
Don't worry. Nobody on this side is going to be like, if you prick a baby, doesn't it cry? I mean, obviously, we all agree that's occurring. On the behaviorist side, we're basically all going to be in agreement because it's so easily empirically verifiable.
Yeah. It's whether the baby is a Turing machine or not. That's the question, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Somebody asked, "What is representational experience?" So it's the thing that you notice. What the experience that you have of this world, like some of it. We would call that consciousness. So it's like because we notice it, we're paying attention to it. But then there's other stuff that is content of our brain that we're not paying any attention to. It's all subconscious, like my heart's beating, I'm breathing, but I'm not even paying attention to it, but I could pay attention to it, right? And then it becomes a part of my consciousness, but then I can also relegate it back to my subconsciousness by ignoring it.
Yeah, there are actually distinctive categories of representational states. I'm pretty sure Heidegger has actually gone into this. I don't like Heidegger though, but just put that out there. So of course, like there are a few examples, like memory is a case of representational experience. Thoughts and dreams are also other very important cases of representational experience, although that doesn't exhaust all cases of representational experience. Like language.
But we wouldn't even want to say that all dreams are representational. All memories are representational. Our brains can be using that information behind the scenes, and it's just not.
Yeah, that's what it means. That's what it means. Like it means that it's using information and transforming that information that was received from an external substantive source. So all it's doing is repurposing or transforming that information in whatever given way. But that's not exhaustive of what representational experience is. Like there are more ways to describe it. Sure.
Can I ask you a question, Shadow? Do you think Darren has explained how you can move from an egoistical evaluation of the world to a, we'll call it altruistic evaluation of the world?
No.
I mean, okay.
You know I don't.
I know. I just want to ask you why. What is it that fundamentally is not convincing?
Fundamentally, I think his leap to the category is, I think it's second order, but he believes. I mean, no, I think it's a first order movement, whereas he thinks it's like, no, it's the basis, it's the beginning of evaluation.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole idea of positive valuation in a vacuum, not attached to any given experience. It is the thing that can be universally attached to any given experience. That thing in and of itself, that literal thing, positive valuation in and of itself, is the thing that's being appended in the first order sense to all these things.
I just don't think that holds us to any particular behaviors.
So let's say I'm just wondering, Darren.
Except for consistency. Go ahead.
Can you, if somebody was to find that they should, in the grand scheme of things, give their life for the betterment of well-being as a whole, even though their own well-being would be sacrificed for it, should they do it?
It depends. It really does depend, because like you as a moral agent have the capacity in and of itself to perform actions that in and of itself may have, okay, so like we'd have to define what well-being is. I would say that well-being is the reliable bringing about pleasure. So that requires consistency. It requires an adherence to the uniformity of nature about how things actually fucking work. So the whole thing about it is well-being is an act. It's not a state of affairs. It's not a state of mind. It is literally a thing that it's a type of action. It's an action that is a reliablest conception of bringing about pleasure. So because you are a moral agent, you're capable of well-being and you're capable of bringing about well-being. So the whole thing about it is because you yourself have those capacities, that may actually outweigh the simple act of you sacrificing your life. Now, in the case of, in the marginal case, I guess you could say, of being put in front of, say, for instance, like in a vacuum, like having to do something atrocious to save 1 trillion people. Like, of course, that can be brought to certain, like that would be an absurd thing. But because the whole act of bringing about, I guess saving of 1 trillion people preserves all of their individual capacities to further bring about more well-being. So the action of literally like being forced to do something atrocious to save all those people, that would be a case of sacrificing, I guess, a sort of a very dispensable thing that is typically treated as very, very strong, but is still dispensable. So that way you can still have consistency towards the fundamental valuation of positive valuation. So that's, yeah, it's a very difficult thing ultimately. That's yeah, bring up that example is just trying to illustrate that it is very fucking difficult, because in a situation you have to do that kind of thing. Yeah, of course. Yeah, but understand there are very difficult to point out conditions that define when we do that and when we simply do not. And the same thing also applies to the ought, it implies can principle. If you cannot bring yourself to do something that's stupidly atrocious, then that's because it's indispensably negatively valued. You cannot dispense of that. It's literally not possible for you to do that. So
the
even
fat man trolley problem, isn't it? It's the fat man trolley problem. You say,
Yeah, exactly.
"Oh, I'm going to push a fat guy in front of a trolley." Oh, but I simply cannot push the fat guy in front of a trolley. Well,
So even an objectivist about consequentialism literally has to accept the fact that they could not have brought themselves to push the fat man off the bridge. So objectivism, even it doesn't actually even fall, like certain people think that it's a purism. It's a type of purism about consequences. It's about all forms of actions. They just need to be brought without the idea of whether or not you actually capable of bringing yourself to do something. And that's what determines moral actions for a purist about consequentialism. No, absolutely not. If you're a hard determinist, this, if anything, saves you from those problems because you literally cannot bring yourself to do such actions. But of course, you can lie about it, but then that's the thing about morality. It's supposed to be using this framework to be true to yourself to produce the best interest. So whether or not you're lying to everyone about whether or not you can push the fat man off is, I think, besides the question.
Let's assume you're a very brave man, right? You've got it together. You're capable of sacrificing yourself at any given moment for something that you truly think is worth it. Now, what I'm asking you is, what would be your motivation to sacrifice yourself to save other people?
Knowing that definitively knowing, so that means in this case, because in order to, I think there would also, I would hold to a principle where if there has to be a case where an agent of well-being has to annihilate themselves in order to maintain consistency to the principle, that requires a type of no false grounds approach to knowledge about whether or not it does reliably produce well-being. Because you need knowledge in order to be able to say that this definitively will, in fact, reliably facilitate further well-being net on the whole. And that's extremely difficult to do. So it would be some sort of extremely rare marginal case. Say, for instance, you did know, then yes.
Okay, but so you do know. You do know, right? So you do know. So let's say you know for a fact that this will definitely produce well-being,
Yes.
Right. Then you should, right?
Given that it does reliably produce or facilitate the grounds for the most amount of well-being compared to if you kept yourself alive. So those are all the variables you have to quantify over. That's extremely difficult. That'd be impossible for most people.
This right here is where Shadow is having a seizure. This is because Shadow's like, okay, well, I can kind of get your point. I think this is, if I may, I think Shadow's probably like, all right, I can get your point of this whole categorization for my own benefit. And then he reaches a point where it's like, okay, well, the pragmatics of truth are breaking down. It's no longer pragmatic. I can see a contradiction. Oh, well, fuck truth.
I would just not do it. I'm not killing myself.
The reason I say that the criteria here requires a type of extremely robust problem of skepticism solving knowledge is because you know definitively, you have that type of acquaintance, definitive, complete knowledge about the fact that you are capable of performing certain actions that will definitively or possibly bring about well-being. Now, talking about performing a certain type of sacrifice, you have to have the same kind of knowledge in order to say definitively that this actually has epistemic value, that this decision has epistemic value higher than a position, say, for instance, where you, okay, so knowing that you would, okay, so I probably need to start this again, sorry. So knowing definitively that you are a capable agent of producing well-being, versus in a situation where you're given the option to sacrifice yourself to produce more well-being. Now, because you do definitively know that you're capable of producing well-being, you are also required, in order to say that your potential is not worth the potential of a specific action of sacrifice, you need to have the same kind of strength in knowledge about the action of sacrifice, the elimination of all potential for you to produce well-being, to be pushed aside for this event causing even more well-being than you are capable of producing yourself as a moral agent. That in and of itself is why this requires a principle of having no false grounds knowledge, because you do have no false grounds knowledge about your own potential. Well, not about your own potential, but about the nature of you as an individual, that you do have a possibility to continue to bring about well-being overall. You'd have to know definitively that this event of you sacrificing yourself to produce well-being will create more possible well-being than you ever could in your life. And that's why
even if I knew that, I would still not do it.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I'm saying. Like, even if Shadow 100% knew the world will be a better place, Shadow would be like, nah. Right.
So that just falls within the category of the ought implies can principle.
No, but then let's just say Shadow could do it. He's just like, why? Why would I ever sacrifice myself? Because what drives me is my will. My will necessitates the valuation of my positive phenomenological experience. I may find myself in the objective, but now that I'm removed from the objective, I no longer value this notion of truth. No, and I think this is the difference. I think, Darren, you value truth in and of itself, innately.
Yes. Yeah.
Shadow, you don't.
Excuse me?
You value truth.
I don't see why you call this truth. Why did we switch from values to you're
no, but I'm saying
guilt drive me nuts.
I know. I'm literally saying that, like, because he's saying that you had absolute knowledge on this. I'm saying that even if you did, even if this was 100% true, you're just like, well, why would I care about this truth?
But I value the truth of the knowledge of it. Now that I have the knowledge, I'm making a decision based on the truth. I don't want to do it. Yeah. So I do value the truth.
I guess you do, but I mean, like, the point is, I guess, is that I guess, but I mean, I guess what he's arguing for is the fact that your rationality, the way you reason to find happiness in the first place, is how you come to the conclusion that of how you should behave in relation to achieving your own well-being. You're saying that your own well-being is now being thrown into doubt, so now you would lose those fundamental prescriptive grounds in order to judge your behavior. And so I think that's the point where you go, yeah, well, I guess I am rolling the dice, but I'm rolling the dice at least is a higher probability. So
here's something that I really need to bring up. Okay, so when it comes to saying that in that case, you just simply wouldn't want to do it because that is a dispensable thing. Like, the ought still applies, regardless of whether or not you want to continue doing it, has absolutely no say, because it's dispensable, in whether or not you ought to do it. So, of course, that would beg the question of why that still isn't ought, and that will take us all the way back down to metaethics again. So, unless you're prepared to go all the way back down there, let me know, and we will. Because I can do this all day. So,
well, I don't want us to get too circular. It would be nice if we could answer some questions.
Yeah,
for sure.
There's not too many questions from what I've seen. If anyone would like to ping us any more questions, I would appreciate that. Somebody asked Shadow if you think a pig can feel pain. I don't know if I've actually got to answer. I could answer that for Shadow.
No.
There we go.
Not phenomenologically.
How do you know that?
I don't know. It's inductive to the best reasoning. We'd have to go back into that conversation.
That's not inductive. That's abductive. So that's nitpicky. Sorry. But the whole thing about it is so this is the same thing, say, for instance, as talking past each other in what reference we are actually referring to. Like, say, for instance, if someone comes up to you and says, okay, so instead of actually bringing you into the analogy or the metaphor, imagine there are two people of distinctive races. Now, one person goes up to the other one, and it says something that's obviously racist, or says something that is extremely prejudicial of the other person's race. Now, that person says that is racist, and that other person responds by saying, our race cannot be racist. Now, because you're using two separate definitions, one could be using, say, for instance, my race is not, it cannot be racist because racism requires prejudice plus institutionalized power or systematic power. of our race, in order
Sure.
for any constituent member of that race to be able to be racist in the first place. So the whole thing about this is, when you're saying phenomenologically pain, you're referring to a completely different thing. Like that's the thing. They do feel like if we are to speak inductively instead of abductively, if we are to speak inductively about pigs experiencing pain, regardless if it's in the phenomenological sense that you're referring to or not, it's redundant to say that, oh well, they don't experience pain because they don't experience it in that conception of the philosophy of our own mind type thing, because that's an irrelevant sense to talk about pain in the moral sense, because in the moral sense we're talking about all forms.
I 100% disagree. No, I 100% disagree.
Hold on. Just give me a sec. I need to. Sorry, I know it's a very long-winded kind of point, but the whole thing about it is, when at least most people who are bringing up this point, and I'd hate to argue like this. I know it's outside of my nature, but it's just for pragmatics. I'm not the biggest fan of pragmatics, but whatever. Okay. So when most people are talking about what is morally relevant to take into consideration when making a moral decision, they're not just simply referring to the type of sentient or conscious experience that is phenomenological, that is reflexive in the sense that it also includes presentational, logical operation, or representational experience. It just requires any sort of constituent part of consciousness on the whole, which includes that basic presentational value that isn't phenomenologically valuable. So that's the
I don't
thing.
think that exists. I think, like the sort of primary consciousness that you're arguing for, I don't think is the thing. So that's where we're disagreeing, and that's why my position follows.
Yeah, I think what Shadow's trying to say, he's not like saying it's a variation in consciousness. He's saying that it's almost consciousness itself. For it to be an experience, it has to be experienced. In other words, you know.
I'm talking about what creates an experiencer, right?
Yeah.
Well, and I'm saying that the level at which you're describing it is not an experiencer.
Although your argument just before was a good point maybe to make him, if he says, why doesn't he value ready-to-hand experience?
It seems like, hold on. It seems like you could actually just continue to define experiencer as being further outside of the reach of most animals. So it seems like that's extremely exploitable.
Well, I think
it has nothing to do with whether you see. Now you're just accusing me of motivated reasoning, like, oh, I'm going to put the dividing line wherever the hell
I apologize if it came across that way. I'm just trying to,
Sure, if it's outside of the reach of animals, and if it's outside of the reach of an infant, then that's just what it is. Like I'm not going to back down. Otherwise, that would be intellectually dishonest of me.
Yeah, exactly. So but the whole thing about it is we're talking about these types of things in reference to what is morally relevant. So when we were talking about these types of things, where we just simply call them as they are, but we say that these things, regardless if you want to define it in a specific way, like, or to close up the reach of consciousness to only that which is phenomenologically relevant, when we refer to the morally relevant terms, we put them under the category of consciousness because it's part of experience, it's part of awareness. Now, whether or not that awareness is phenomenologically rich, if you would call it that way, I think is besides the point. We're only referring to consciousness in this very broad sense because all things that are consciousness have presentational experiences in both the sensational and the logical operational sense, as well as representational experience. Except animals themselves seem to only have that presentational experience constituent part of consciousness. So it doesn't mean that they're thereby somehow meaningless if they don't fall under your phenomenological conception of consciousness, because it still falls under the purview of the general conception of consciousness that still has moral prescriptive power, regardless if it falls under phenomenological experience.
I think you're on the side of equivocation, because I'm not saying consciousness is important no matter how it's defined. You're saying it is important no matter how it's defined, and you're trying to push the definition as broad as you can. I'm saying that the definition that you have, as broad as it is, it doesn't make what an experience is, and only experiences are morally relevant.
Yeah, you see, I would like to say is can I ask you a question, Darren? Okay, just to before anyone really Shadow, well, I know you probably, depending on what he answers, you may hate this. Do you think that an AI is conscious, or or a plant as well? So we'll get onto that in a second. So and why not?
Okay, so that's a loaded question. That requires conditionalization. So under the conditions that it has the necessary and sufficient essential constituent parts that creates consciousness, then yeah, any object in the universe is capable of being conscious, so long as it has those necessary and sufficient essential constituent parts in relation to one another. If they're not in relation to one another, then of course no, because that relation is exactly what establishes that higher order property, such as mind, such as consciousness. Because it's not simply the fact that these two things happen to be exhibited in the same general area as each other. They have to be in relation to one another. It has to be a very real thing that's occurring. So, like, ultimately, like AI could be conscious, and under certain conditions, it might not be conscious. Like, it's a very conditional analogy or an example or question.
I agree. I was just kind of wondering how you'd respond to it more than anything. Although I think it's funny because you sounded like Dave, almost like saying that, but it very well might be the substance that creates consciousness and not the program. So, for example, having this complex program and that is algorithmic that mightn't actually produce consciousness. Would you say that's the case, or would you say that it's actually if we were to emulate the human brain, for example, could that be conscious?
Yeah, I think it is the functional connection between I guess two essential first order properties that can create a second order property, and that's ultimately how my metaphysics works. Is the emergence that occurs on the intersection between the interaction or relation between two properties. So that ultimately, when it comes to mind, I would say that mind is a higher order property that just happens to be on the intersection between two second order properties. And the second order properties are, one, processing, and two, I think it was reception of information, of substantive information. Because in order for someone to be aware, in order for any given thing to be aware, at least according to the conceptual analysis,
why wouldn't a camera be conscious then?
Go ahead.
Like they meet your requirements. Like a camera meets your requirements.
Could a camera?
A camera takes in information and it processes it.
No. Because so there requires. I do see your point there. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So of course, yeah, this does require further conceptualization, and I never denied that from the start. Yeah, of course. I'm not. It's not a complete argument, but the whole thing about it is, I'm trying to bring up the general examples, the general ideas that do undergird this entire framework, this entire idea, the idea of morality, the idea of moral relevancy, all that kind of stuff, including the mind. So my metaphysics, of course, it works by the intersection of properties, and yeah, of course, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the mind in of itself is, of course, I think, dependent on brain states as well as central nervous system states. How the central nervous system relates to the brain is exactly what gives us our perception of being in a location, because our physical senses are receiving that information at specific locations, and we experience those locations as part of our phenomenological experience, as part of our general awareness experience. So the whole thing about that is ultimately what facilitates the idea of or any concept of mind in the first place. So because otherwise, like if you're referring to awareness as not requiring any sort of substantive information to be received in a certain way, then like I don't know what you could be talking about. Would you be talking about two completely different things?
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to probably, I hope, end that there. I think we can. Like, I'm gonna have a quick jab at Shadow now, because I'm just
Go ahead.
I'm just trying to poke holes at you. Although I'd say maybe a way to resolve that is, one of the things I try to resolve it with Shadow is argue that it's an actual process, and it's almost like a Minsky's virtual mind, where we're creating algorithms which are actually based upon not just the reception of information sensory wise, which is processed semantically, but it's a process about a process, is what I think, and I think it's something that aligns maybe with what you argue. But then, we didn't talk about this another time, and I think it's interesting because phenomenology is something, and I think me and Shadow have both talked about this at the point, is that we don't actually know where consciousness begins. Not yet, anyway. So we could definitely talk about this until the end of time. Right. Just double check if there's any more questions. I think there was a question that a guy called Novi, if you be, right, okay. It's for you, actually, Darren. If you would be God and could do anything and nobody can harm you, and if you have desires, would you choose to satisfy your own desires without caring about morality? And
Wait,
why
sorry,
would you care?
is that a question about
if you were God and you were in a state of aporia, and apnea rather, would you just do your own thing without consideration of other people, or?
No, because I still value the thing, that category. So if I didn't, if that's an example of where I didn't actually have that category of values intrinsic to my very existence as an awareness of some sort, as a mind, if there's anything that drives my action, then I would have to be 100% consistent and comport to that category of values itself. And ultimately, it all boils down, regardless of what kind of mind you are, if you have any sort of thing that is categorically a set of positive valuation that drives your action, regardless, if anything drives your action, there's going to be some sort of degree of positive valuation if you are a phenomenological experience. So comporting to the fact that, yes, you do have positive valuation driving your action, being consistent to that to ensure that, yes, you are acting morally, requires that you also pay mind and be consistent to other agents that also contain that very second order property. So that's my response to that. At least partial. What I would do is simply just comport myself to what, especially if I was infinitely knowledgeable and had a special kind of power, I would do everything in my power to ensure, with my massive amount of knowledge, ensure that what happens is in fact that which reliably and definitively brings about the most well-being possible.
So just to clarify, is your argument then that if God does exist and he was omniscient, that by definition he must be omnibenevolent?
I think so. If he's an intentional agent, but if God isn't an intentional agent, so I don't think God can be a mind and still have his properties. But that's debatable. I've heard discussions between people like Jack Ungstreich, and Darth Dawkins or Ozymandias Ramses II, all these people who've debated presuppositionalists, Floyd FP, another fantastic example. I've heard their arguments delve into the realm where it's God wouldn't even be able to be a mind if he wants to sustain these kinds of properties and wants to do these kinds of actions or be in this specific type of way or have this specific type of nature. So I don't think it is necessarily possible for a God to maintain being a mind and be driven by intentional states that drive action without having to be necessarily comporting to what exactly it is that is driving the action, which is positive valuation. Once again, so yeah, that's the thing. We experience drive action urgency as positive valuation.
You see, I would argue that what makes the being themselves, because they asked me to answer it as well, I would say that what we are, the self, is an evaluative process based on linguistics, and that is an internalized construct of I. So they would have no choice but to evaluate to actually adhere to a universal construct. Okay, so there's one more question for Darren, and then I'll move to the last one for Shadow, and then I think we should wrap it up if you guys are game. Yeah. Is that okay with you, Shadow, as well?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so question for Darren here is, many vegans support the idea of abolishing and exploiting animals, but how do we grow crops sustainably without supporting animals? That was by Dahidi, and he says, and he misses you there. Dahadi, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm not an economist. I'm not a geoengineer. So the question is kind of beyond my purview of a specialization.
I think it just means that, like, I think if I'm interpreting right, he's like, but can we ever get away from exploiting animals? I think it's an appeal to futility. Like, we're not going to create the same suffering we seek to avoid.
Oh no. I think what's ultimately more efficient is whatever requires less total energy. Now, there are actually arguments from physics about the economic expenditure of veganism over animal products, and the fact that, in fact, literally producing animal products is a massive waste of energy and a massive waste of resources. That that in and of itself, because it expends so much more energy than the road down towards veganism. Ultimately, there will be some sort of economic or sociological physics that pulls towards veganism regardless, because it is way more economical. So whatever way actually facilitates that is yet to be known. I'm pretty sure actually Cambridge or Oxford actually did a few studies on this a few years ago about like what exactly it would take for the world to go vegan and what exactly would be the results. Now they seem to talk about it very positively, as far as I remember. So I wouldn't put too much of an investment in the idea that it's not possible. I think it's very possible, and I think it's more efficient. So that's ultimately my response to that.
Yeah. And if I may chip in just for being a vegan, I think it's a easy one to respond to anyway, because if people were actually producing crops to feed animals in the first place, you're going to be producing more crops to feed to animals. So you will actually be increasing deaths and exploiting more animals. And since it's what's possible
Not
and
necessarily.
well, we can go down.
Depends on the method.
It depends. Well, it can depend on any method at once. If I start talking about hydroponics, plants is definitely is almost always going to produce less harm to animals than intentionally murdering them.
Another thing.
I think that harvesting grain would cause more deaths than grass feeding a cow.
Here's the thing.
Wait a minute. You can't sustain the population on grass feeding cows. You need.
No, you can't. I agree, but I'm just disagreeing with the statement as a universal.
Okay. So you could contingently farm a certain amount of cows and feed them to a certain amount of people, but then you could also use permacultures. You could also use hydroponics, and we could just do whatever we could. And I think that as vegans, yes, we do have a moral obligation to the most ethical forms of farming. Now, sorry, Darren, we're segueing. We're moving on. Okay, so right, Shadow, you said because about determinism. You said that before. I heard you. Filthy hard determinism. You said that what good would it do to try and influence someone's mental states prescriptively? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, if someone's deterministic, that's not the same to say as unchanging. So they would be determined in a way that would allow for change, right? So if you can present the right sort of information that their brain will take as information in order to elicit a change, you can do such a thing. Determinism doesn't actually stop that.
Okay, good. I'm just making sure. Just about to check. I was going to say, am I not determined to make an argument that would reformat your decision-making process, which ultimately determines your volition? So, yeah, it's like that whole cause and effect chain. I could just so happen to be the right domino. Also, the argument could be made as well. You say, what's the point of making this prescriptive argument? Well, what's the point of not making it? Because I have no choice anyway.
Yeah, so, pretty much.
Yeah, it's just one of those situations. And, I think as well, we do talk, I think in ethics, I think all three of us can agree that we do talk of the freedom of the will in these discussions, because if we have no choice but to, because it really doesn't make sense to talk about not having any freedom of the will and then talk about actually have any actions day to day and not just go, I just do what I do. I just do.
Well, I mean, you're talking to a descriptivist, so maybe that's exactly what I'm doing.
Well, you're still in this conversation. Anyway.
I have no choice, Lewis.
But anyway, I think
should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think that wraps it up. I mean, I need to go to bed. I shouldn't be up this late, really. But grey and grey. Anyway, yeah. So I hope you have all enjoyed this conversation. If you have any questions for Darren and Shadow that I have not answered, I'm really sorry. I did try to go back as far as I could to see questions. I don't know why. Like I was trying to pay attention as it was coming in, but even then, there wasn't too many questions, so I don't think I missed any. But regardless, if I did miss you, I'm really sorry. Leave it in the comment section below, and perhaps Darren and Shadow can answer you if they see it.
I mean, yeah, I'll be perusing the comment section for a few days after this. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope that helps everyone. And if you'd like to see a round 2 between Shadow and Darren, let them know. If there's any questions that you two would have for each other in the future, I think it'd be very interesting to hear you just have it out, because I think you hold very different views, but at the same time agree on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
Yeah, that's how it goes. That's the way philosophy goes. Most of us agree for the most part, and then fundamentally disagree on the most important parts. So, yeah. So let's just wrap it up there. I would like to thank. I was going to say, I'd like to thank Darren, and I would like to thank Shadow for coming on. I really appreciate this. And if you would like to give your goodbyes or whatever.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for watching.
And thank you for putting up with my long-windedness. I appreciate it, guys.
No problem.
Yeah. Right. Thanks again to everyone who watched. And as always, try to gain some perspective.